Arthur R. Ashe, Jr. Home court. Arthur Robert Ashe, Jr. was born in Richmond, Virginia on July 10, 1943. Richmond was a segregated city at that time, like the rest of the South. Black people and white people went to separate restaurants, churches, and movie theaters. They had separate schools and public spaces. When Arthur was 4, his father got a job as a caretaker at a segregated park for blacks. The Ashes moved to a house right in the middle of the playground. Arthur loved sports and enjoyed living in the park, but he was skinny and sickly. His father wouldn't let him play football. What could Arthur do? The park had swimming pools, baseball fields, and 4 tennis courts. Arthur learned that being fast and agile was important for some of these sports. The tennis courts became very important to Arthur as he grew older. When Arthur was only 6, 2 things that happened that would change his life. First, his mother died suddenly after an operation. Arthur had only a few pictures of her. Second, Arthur met Ron Charity. Ron was a talented African-American tennis player. Shake hands with a racket. One day, while Ron Charity was practicing on the playground, he saw Arthur. Ron asked Arthur if he wanted to learn to play tennis. Arthur ran to the equipment box and picked out a tennis racket. Ron taught him to hold the racket with an Eastern grip. "It's like shaking hands," he told Arthur. He taught Arthur how to serve the ball and to put it into play. Soon, Arthur was playing tennis. Ron could tell that Arthur was a gifted tennis player. In 1953, Ron introduced Arthur to Dr. Robert Johnson. Dr. J had trained a famous African-American tennis player named Althea Gibson. Dr. J agreed to coach Arthur. Arthur knew he was lucky to be able to work with Dr. J. Sometimes he and Dr. J would take the bus to travel to tennis matches, but because they were African Americans, they had to sit in the back of the bus. Althea Gibson was the first African American woman to win at the Wimbledon and U.S. Open tennis matches. White person's game. When tennis was first played in England, it was played by British royalty. In the United States, tennis was once played only in private clubs called country clubs. The clubs did not allow African Americans to join. Arthur Ashe later said, "Some folks call tennis a rich people's sport or a white person's game. I guess I started too early because I thought it was just something fun to do." Arthur was only 12 when he started playing in tennis tournaments. Sometimes he experienced racism because he was African American. One time, some white players at a tennis match destroyed property. They blamed Arthur. But other times, Arthur found friendly players. In Charlottesville, Arthur went to the movies with a group of white tennis players. The ticket seller wouldn't sell Arthur a ticket, so all the boys refused to go in. Arthur wanted to practice all the time, even in the winter. But there were no indoor courts for African Americans in Richmond. So in 1960, Arthur moved to St. Louis, Missouri. His father had to stay behind with Arthur's younger brother. Arthur lived with some of Dr. J's friends while in St. Louis. The way you play. Arthur was a senior in high school when he moved to St. Louis. He graduated at the top of his class. Then he got an athletic scholarship to the University of California at Los Angeles, called UCLA. Arthur had played a lot of tennis matches by then. At UCLA, Arthur was captain of the tennis team. He led the team to win a national college championship, the NCAA championship. Arthur's father always told him it was important to be a good person. Arthur's coach, Dr. J, taught him to lose with a smile and stay calm. Arthur listened. He was already becoming known for his controlled behavior on the tennis court. "I've heard you can tell someone's personality by the way they play tennis," Arthur once said. In 1963, Arthur made the Davis Cup team for the United States. It was the first time an African American was on the team. Arthur was becoming famous. A different kind of serve. Arthur studied hard at UCLA. He went to Australia with the Davis Cup team in 1965, but that meant he had to put off graduation for a year. He also had to make a decision about serving in the Army. The United States was fighting a war in Vietnam. Arthur decided to join the Reserve Officers Training Corps, called ROTC. This way, he could be trained as an officer in the military. In 1966, Arthur earned his college degree in business. Then the Army sent him to the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York. Arthur was now in the Army. While Arthur was at West Point, he became more aware of the civil rights movement. People were working for equal rights for African Americans. In 1968, a friend of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. asked Arthur to make a speech. Dr. King was a leader in the civil rights movement. Arthur agreed to make the speech, but his speech was not against white people. Instead, he said that African Americans should show the world that they were as good as whites. The Washington Post newspaper headline wrote, "Ashe becomes activist." An activist is a person who speaks out about a problem or a political cause. But the Army told Arthur not to make any more political speeches. It was against Army rules. Well done, son. While serving at West Point, Arthur still played tennis. In the summer of 1968, he played in the U.S. Open tennis tournament. It was his first Grand Slam tournament. It was one of the more important tournaments in tennis. In the final match, Tom played against Tom Akker, a professional player from the Netherlands. Professional players earn a living playing tennis. They can accept money to play. Arthur was only an amateur player. Amateurs can play for fun and cannot accept money to play. But Arthur played so well he won the tournament. It was the first time an African American had won the U.S. Open. Arthur stood with his father at the final awards ceremony. His father had tears in his eyes. He whispered to Arthur, "Well done, son." Arthur went on to win his second Grand Slam tournament in 1970. It was called the Australian Open. There are 4 Grand Slam tournaments: the U.S. Open, the Australian Open, the French Open, and Wimbledon. A player wins the Grand Slam by winning all 4 tournaments in 1 year. Match point. Arthur became a professional tennis player. He began playing matches all over the world. 1 year, he played on 5 continents. He especially wanted to play tennis in South Africa. At that time, South Africa had a system of government called apartheid. Under apartheid, people were treated differently according to their race. Arthur wanted to learn about life in South Africa. He hoped to serve as a role model to black South Africans, but to visit, he had to get official permission called a visa. He applied for one in 1969, but he didn't get it. Arthur was not allowed to visit South Africa. He could not play tennis there because he was black. Finally, in 1973, Arthur got his visa. When he saw the effects of apartheid in South Africa, he became very upset. He would work for many years to end apartheid. Arthur still had more tennis to play. In 1975, Arthur traveled to England to play at Wimbledon. Jimmy Connors, the #1 player in the world, was the favorite to win. But Arthur shocked the world. He won the match and became the first African-American man to win at Wimbledon. A life-changing picture. During the next year, Arthur won 5 more tennis tournaments. He also met Jean Montesami. She was a photographer who wanted to take his picture. Arthur and Jean fell in love and were married in 1977. The wedding took place at the United Nations in New York City. Years later, Arthur and Jean had a daughter. They wanted her to have a very special name. Can you guess what it was? They called her Camera. In July 1979, Arthur was teaching tennis to disadvantaged children in New York when he had a heart attack. 6 months later, Arthur had to have heart surgery. Sadly, he soon realized that his days of playing tennis tournaments were over. Arthur retired from competition in 1980 with 818 wins, 260 losses, and 51 titles. Arthur was born in July 1943. He had a heart attack in July 1979. Do the math. He was only 36 years old. Honors and illness. Even though Arthur couldn't compete, he stayed involved in tennis. In 1980, he was asked to be the captain of the Davis Cup team. It was a great honor. He was captain for 5 years. The team won in 1981 and 1982. As captain, Arthur had to coach John McEnroe. John McEnroe was the opposite of Arthur. Arthur was always calm, while McEnroe was often angry and yelled a lot, but they got along. During this time, Arthur also wrote books about tennis, but his health became a problem for him again. In 1983, Arthur needed another operation on his heart. Because he was weak after the surgery, doctors gave him a blood transfusion. But Arthur got better again. In 1985, Arthur got some good news. He had been voted into the International Tennis Hall of Fame. He went with his family to the ceremony in Newport, Rhode Island. Arthur called it the honor of a lifetime. And that's a picture of the Davis Cup. More bad news. Remember Arthur's visit to South Africa? He had seen many whites-only signs that reminded him of Richmond when it was segregated. In 1985, he decided to take part in a protest in Washington, D.C. against apartheid. He knew he would probably be arrested for protesting, and he was. Being arrested was very hard for Arthur because he had always been a model of good behavior, but he felt so strongly about South Africa he knew he had to speak out. 3 years later, Arthur found that he had no feeling in his hand. The doctors examined him and decided he needed brain surgery, but the news was even worse than that. The doctors learned that Arthur had a virus called HIV. They believed the blood Arthur received during the transfusion in 1983 was contaminated with the virus. Under apartheid in South Africa, blacks did not have the same rights as whites, including the right to vote in national elections. They were not allowed in the same places. Fortunately, South Africa began to end apartheid in 1990. By 1994, everyone in South Africa had the right to vote in elections. Many people, like Arthur, helped bring about this positive change. What we give. The HIV virus in Arthur's body turned into a disease called AIDS. It is a very serious disease. Arthur was often very sick. He knew that there was no cure, but Arthur had always been optimistic. He was a positive thinker. On his good days, Arthur still worked to help with tennis programs for disadvantaged children. He still worked to support equal treatment for all races. Arthur once said, "From what we get, we can make a living. From what we give, however, makes a life." In 1992, Arthur announced to the public that he had AIDS. It was hard to tell the world about his terrible disease. It was also hard to tell his young daughter, Camera. In December of that year, he gave a speech to the United Nations. He thought it was one of the most important speeches of his life. He spoke about his disease, and he encouraged people to raise money to help find a cure for AIDS. Every Christmas, Arthur took Camera to visit poor families. They gave away toys, including some of Camera's own new ones. A first at the last. Arthur made plans for a Valentine's Day dance in 1993, but AIDS had made his body weak and he caught a lung disease called pneumonia. Arthur became very ill. Sadly, he didn't live until Valentine's Day. He died on February 6, 1993. He was only 49 years old. Arthur's daughter Camera was the same age Arthur was when his own mother died. Remember how Arthur didn't have many pictures of his mother? Jean Ashe didn't want that to happen to Camera. She had taken a lot of photos of Arthur and Camera when Arthur was alive. Later, she published these pictures in a book called Daddy and Me. Arthur Robert Ashe Jr. was buried in his hometown of Richmond, Virginia. Governor Douglas Wilder gave Arthur a special honor. He had Arthur's casket displayed in the governor's mansion. It was the first time anyone had been honored that way since the Civil War. Court of Champions. Arthur Ashe was an athlete and an activist. We remember him as the first African American man to win the U.S. Open and Wimbledon, and we remember him for his fight to end apartheid and to help those with AIDS. After his death, Arthur received many honors. In 1996, a bronze statue of him was placed on Monument Avenue in Richmond. In the statue, Arthur is holding a book and a tennis racket. It was designed by Paul de Pasquale of Richmond. In 1997, the stadium where the U.S. Open tennis tournament is played was named Arthur Ashe Stadium. It is located in Queens, New York. Arthur was also awarded honorary degrees from many famous colleges in Virginia and other states. And in 2009, President Bill Clinton named Arthur to the Tennis U.S. Open Court of Champions. The end.